Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Pandemic Classroom here with Mr. Woods. So, as you might be able to guess, we're going to be talking about the Roman Empire today. That's not really a simple thing to do, right? We say Roman Empire and conjures to mind images of the Colosseum and gladiator fights, and all of that's fair. We'll be talking about that. But the Roman Empire itself is not something simple to say because there were many successors to the Roman Empire and people that picked up the pieces afterward, and exactly how it fell apart is still kind of in contention. So we're going to be talking about all of that as we move down the road. Okay, so just as a little refresher, right when we last left off, um, you saw the strange case of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Right, Caesar had risen to this unique level of power. He had become dictator for life, essentially, in Rome, and he suffered at the hands of senators who chose to assassinate him on the floor of their meeting house at Pompey's Theater. So, Caesar's assassination doesn't exist in isolation. It doesn't happen with making no waves, right? There's a lot of fallout from this. Of course, the immediate fallout is political instability in Rome. Right, this guy was in charge of everything. He had his hand in every proverbial cookie jar, and so when you strike him down, you create a power vacuum. Now, people try to fill that role, but are unable to successfully really do so. What you end up having is a second triumvirate form. Now, Gaius Julius Caesar the Younger, better known as Octavian, becomes consul in Rome. Now, he is the heir to everything Julius Caesar left behind. He's actually Julius Caesar's great nephew, I think. Not that Julius Caesar didn't have children, he did, but he didn't appoint any of them to be his heir. He chose Octavian to become his heir. So Octavian takes over, becomes consul, and he enters into an agreement with Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. And the three of them conspire to stop the fighting after the death of Julius Caesar, hunt down the assassins of Caesar, and bring them to justice, and then kind of guide Rome back to, a successful landing point, essentially. This is all going well. They're very successful until, of course, what happened in the first triumvirate. One of them dies, right? Marcus Lepidus dies, leaving Julius Caesar the Younger, or Octavian, and Mark Antony stuck on separate halves of the Roman Empire. Right, Rome, we say Roman Empire. It should be fair to point out that Rome might not actually be an empire at this point, because Rome doesn't have an emperor. But by the real definition of empire, Rome has been an empire for hundreds of years. Because an empire is when one governing body, typically one person, rules over many different groups of people. Well, that was Rome by the time it had expanded outside of Italy. But at this point, Rome's still a republic, even though it's kind of in its death throes. Mark Antony goes to Egypt, becomes governor of Egypt. He's kind of responsible for managing the interests of Rome in Egypt. He's there with Cleopatra, Julius Caesar's former love interest, who now actually becomes his love interest. In this time, Octavian's stuck back in Rome. And so there's two halves of the world here. And there's stories, right, that Mark Antony is going to sort of betray Caesar. That maybe he doesn't have the best interests of the Roman Empire at heart. So the story starts to develop much the same way the story between Julius Caesar and Pompey did. So that brings us to this kind of story that exists. Mark Antony is smart, but Octavian is smarter. Octavian goes to the Roman people and portrays Antony as having been seduced by Cleopatra, that he didn't have a choice in siding with her, that she sort of forced him to do this. Now, when he does this, he kind of accuses Antony of being weak, maybe being a traitor to the interests of Rome, and then he declares war, or convinces the Senate to declare war on Cleopatra, and they agree. So that forces Antony into basically an impossible choice. Either give up everything you have, go back to Rome and be seen as a coward or a weakling, or fight against Rome. Octavian and Antony go to war. There's several conflicts, but the main one occurs at Actium, off the Nile, and Antony and Cleopatra lose, and so Mark Antony will commit suicide. Cleopatra will very shortly after commit suicide. Their children are taken to Rome and are actually housed with, I believe it's Octavia. I believe it's Octavian's sister that takes the children in and raises them. She actually was taking care of several children of Mark Antony, so adding a couple more to the mix isn't a big deal. But that child of Caesar and Cleopatra's, that child's not going to make it. Octavian makes sure of that. And that basically puts Octavian as the sole ruler of Rome. He's back in the position that Julius Caesar once had been. In 27 BC, he takes on the name Imperator, meaning one who commands, and Augustus, meaning the chosen one. Rome becomes a principate, and he becomes a princeps, or first citizen of Rome. Now, he never calls himself an emperor. He never refers to himself that way. He refers to himself as a princeps. But as far as we're concerned, Octavian is the first emperor of Rome. And in 27 BC, the Roman Empire officially begins. So there's this term that gets tossed around, this term Pax Romana. So Pax in Latin means peace, Romana, Rome. So the peace of Rome, or the Roman peace. It's this time after, really after this war between Octavian, who will now be known as Augustus, and Mark Antony. Everything's peaceful in Rome. That doesn't mean Rome's not at war. That just means that inside the boundaries of the Roman Empire, it's safe. It's safe to travel. There's massive expansion of infrastructure, expansion of roads, the trade routes themselves, buildings, mines, workshops, everything. There's an economic explosion. This is Rome's golden age. Now, this lasts basically until the last of what's known as the Five Good Emperors dies. So land is gained. Britannia, or Britain, is taken by Claudius. Dacia, Mesopotamia, by the Emperor Trajan. The borders are fortified by the Emperor Hadrian. And as you can see down there, Germania in 9 CE, or Germany, as we would call it. There's a little bit of difficulty getting Germany under control. There's the incident known as the Teutoburg Forest. The short story of it, although the story itself is fascinating, there was a Roman commander named Arminius, who was actually German. He was a German prince, but he had sworn his allegiance to Rome. Was in secret communication with the German peoples and planned to ambush the Romans. led 3 Roman legions, so that's about 16,000 troops, into the Teutoburg Forest in Germany and allowed them to be ambushed. Participated in the ambush himself, killed the Roman, I think his name was Varro there, the Roman general, and essentially destroyed 3 Roman legions wholesale. And after that, the Romans never tried to go back to Germany, ever. They never conquer that part of Europe. They expand pretty much everywhere else, but never into Germany. But like I said, Arminius, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there about him. He's quite the figure. This graphic here is to kind of show you what I mean by the roads, right? So these Roman roads are fascinating, and that picture on the left is actually a photograph that I took while I was there, and you can see the chariot marks carved into the stone over hundreds and hundreds of years of use, thousands of years of use. Now, these are very intricately built. You have kind of a base layer of rubble, and then stone slabs and pebbles and gravel to kind of fill everything in. The roads are beveled slightly to allow water runoff, and then you have these big paving stones laid on top. Now, unlike the picture to the right, Roman roads never have bends. They're always built at right angles because the Romans didn't really have the math to calculate degrees of like circles like that, even though they would do domes, but roads were always built in straight lines. And the phrase "all roads lead to Rome" is not really misleading. When Rome would conquer somewhere, they would build roads back to the nearest road that linked up to Rome. That way, if they needed to move their troops quickly, they could. The roads were exactly wide enough for 2 Roman legions to march side by side, if necessary, to be able to go from one part of the empire to the other very quickly. So as we talked about before, part of the Pax Romana, some of the things that occurred during the reign of Augustus Caesar, road creation, establishing sea trade routes, expansion of farming. There's these kind of local administrations, that bureaucracy almost, civil service, and the government itself stabilized. And Rome was just kind of put into a position to be successful for an extended period of time. So then the question becomes, how do we, what happens when Octavian's gone? How do we get a good ruler? Because there's some big problems we run into here. If you have a family line of rulers, which was kind of the thing to have done throughout most of Rome, you end up with problems within the family. You end up giving someone a position of power just because they're somebody's kid, which isn't always good. That may not necessarily be somebody who's qualified, and you have a hard time getting rid of a leader, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to kill your uncle? I mean, yeah, but that's not always an easy choice. So life wasn't always easy with these kind of decisions. But what Octavian did, or Augustus, is something similar to what his great uncle had done. He chose an heir that was not his blood. Right, so he chose Tiberius, who was his stepson. So, Roman emperors. Rome was essentially an autocracy at the time that emperors are holding power. It means one person has essentially unlimited power. There's 3 bad emperors we're going to talk about. That's Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And we'll hit a couple others on the way there as we go. So, starting off, good old Caligula. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus is his name. We tend to call him by his nickname, Caligula, which is Little Boots in Latin. And you'll see he only ruled for almost 4 years. I believe there was a documentary once that was called Caligula 1400 Days of Terror. So the first 6 months or so of his rule, he's relatively good. After that, he's kind of bad. He might even be considered insane. He's known for his quote, "I don't care if they respect me so long as they fear me." He did some silly things, like set off with several Roman legions to go conquer Britain. Reached the coastline in northern Gaul, chucked a spear out into the English Channel, declared victory over Neptune, the god of the sea, and had all of the troops walk along the shoreline collecting seashells as his trophies of victory. He tried to make his horse a senator, making a comment that it would do a better job. Of course, yeah, they didn't go for that. They didn't let that happen. So he made his horse a high priest instead, and did so successfully. And then he's kind of paranoid, a little bit delusional, and he ends up assassinated by his own guards, the people who are responsible for keeping him safe, take him out. So those same guards that went through extinguishing the lives of Caligula and others ran into Claudius. So Claudius is Caligula's uncle, who was found hiding as they were killing off the spawn of Caligula, and he ends up bribing the guards to name him emperor. Now Claudius isn't really bad. He is different. He has what we believe to be some physical and mental disabilities. We definitely know that he walked with a pretty severe limp, probably due to a clubbed foot, and he had some severe curvature of the spine. But he's a successful ruler. He builds what's known as the Aqua Claudia, or the Waters of Claudius, which becomes one of the largest aqueducts in Rome. He also conquers Britain, something that Caligula had sent out to do, but not been successful. Got a little distracted. Now, Claudius does marry his niece. This would be Caligula's sister, Agrippina the Younger, and he ends up adopting her son Nero as his heir, and then she poisons him and kills him, making her son the emperor of Rome. So Claudius is known for having said to do no evil is good, and to intend none is better. Brings us to Nero. I often call him Neckbeard Nero. And his famous last words are, "What an artist dies in me." So Nero is quite the interesting figure. Nero was a relatively good ruler, but he was, I say good in that he was successful in ruling. He was bad as a person. He is one of the first emperors to actually persecute Christians. So he's ruling in the 50s. Christianity at that point had been around for about 20 years. And so Christians are starting to be identifiable, and Nero starts to persecute them. He doesn't want any any monotheists in Rome, because the Roman emperor is a god. And Nero starts to use Christians as scapegoats, blaming them for the country's problems, blaming people coming into the country for its problems. And he's pretty severe about this. He was known to crucify and then cover Christians in pitch and burn them in his garden to basically be nightlights. You also have matricide. Right? Nero kills his own mother. Not only does he kill her, but he makes the attempt 3 separate times. There's specifically one time where he tried to poison her unsuccessfully. Another where he decided to sink a ship that she was on and was unsuccessful in killing her. And finally, he just sends his guards outright to hunt her down and kill her. And according to the stories, at least, or the tradition, when the guards kind of burst into the room of the Praetorians, she kind of points at her stomach and says, "Strike here first. This bore Nero." He may be responsible for the Great Fire of Rome. There's no proof of this. He wasn't actually in the city at the time. So the whole phrase "Nero fiddled while Rome burned," not necessarily true. Although there is supposedly he stood on top of a tower and recited the fall of Troy as Rome burned. But he may not have even been in the city while it happened. However, he does take all of the burned down homes of the poor and confiscate the land to build his palace, what's known as the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. It was, I'm talking massive, like hundreds and hundreds of rooms, lapis lazuli, diamonds, rubies set into the walls, gold, everything. Like it would have looked like a Bathurst palace. It was just insane. There are still some rooms that have survived, so we know what it looked like, and we have stories. And it had an entire swimming pool complex. Like it was massive. Nero also fancied himself, like I said, an artist, both a painter and an actor, and he would often bring people in to watch him act out all parts of a play. And so, he ends up being declared public enemy number one by the Senate, and they send guards to kill him, and he ends up committing suicide by assistance of a slave. And like I said, his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." Okay, so that brings me to Commodus. Now you'll see we have a time jump here. We've hopped ahead about 90 years because there's going to be some folks that we need to talk about in between. We will talk about Marcus Aurelius, but this is his son, Commodus. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, that is actually talking about Commodus, not Russell Crowe, but Joaquin Phoenix's character is supposed to be Commodus. He is largely responsible for the devaluation of Roman currency, and we'll talk about that. He didn't like dealing with politics. He would rather participate in gladiator fights. He would basically give the gladiators wooden weapons, and he would go in with real ones and fight them. He's a megalomaniac. He's obsessed with his own power and grandeur. You can see the picture right beside me. He has himself sculpted there in the likeness of the Roman god Hercules. So that's how he thought of himself. He's assassinated in 192 by his wrestling partner. He's actually strangled to death in the bathtub by his wrestling partner. So, that's fun. Okay, so that brings us to Nerva, and you'll notice the timeline. We're back to 96 here. I do want to just mention briefly, there are several Roman emperors in the intermedium there. So between Nero and Nerva, you do have the Emperor Galba, who took power after Nero's suicide. Then you have Otho, who was later appointed by the Praetorians. You have Vitellius, who took power using some of the German legions, and he was in opposition to Galba. And then you have Vespasian, who takes the Eastern legions and takes over that way. Titus, who is Vespasian's son, and then you have Domitian, who is Titus's brother, basically. So they will also have power in between there. Now, Nerva is really probably most important because he has a very short reign, but he chooses his heir. So he starts this tradition of choosing your heirs instead of allowing it to be your child. So he chose Trajan. Trajan here is a very powerful military commander. He is largely responsible for making Rome as large as it was, its greatest extent of expansion. So he built a lot of public buildings and named a lot of things after himself: Trajan's Column, Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Baths, etc. And it's likely he died due to natural causes, but he did choose an heir before that, which was Hadrian. Now, I like Hadrian. Hadrian's one of my favorite emperors. Hadrian is the first emperor who's not actually from Italy. He's from Hispania, or Spain. Ruled from 117 to 138. And he consolidates all of that land that Trajan acquired. And he builds this massive wall complex in northern Britain known as Hadrian's Wall. Now, It is largely expansive. It's mostly in ruins today. You can see down that picture on the bottom left. But it would have been basically a super wall. So you think of the Great Wall of China, perhaps. Now, this wall was not as long, but every so often there would be like mega forts built into the wall. It's crazy. It was just massive. Brings us to Antoninus Pius. He was a relatively peaceful ruler. He got the nickname Pius because he is responsible for getting the Roman Senate to deify Hadrian, and also he had something to do with rebuilding some of the things in Rome. But they almost refused to deify Hadrian because he wasn't Roman as far as they were concerned. He was Spanish. Administrator, builder. To be honest, the good emperors are a lot less fun to talk about because we're drawn into the intrigue of crazy people. So the bad emperors are always more fun. So I say all of that with reservation when it comes to Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is often known as the philosopher emperor, and you'll see I have a copy of his book here. So his book is known as the Meditations. It's also sometimes known as the Emperor's Handbook. So it's a wonderful text. It's broken up in a very readable way. Basically, the books are sort of broken into sections to be read and lessons. Essentially, he has kind of numbered lessons set up by book, and it's according to the story he wrote this book while on campaign. So these were kind of his thoughts, and he's a Stoicist. So if you remember back when we talked about Zeno, the Greek Stoicist, he's participating in the same school of thought. So a man's worth is no greater than his ambitions. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. I really like that one. And then, if it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it. And my students, if you've paid attention in my classroom, I have a giant poster of that says integrity, and it has that particular quote from Marcus Aurelius on it. So he fought against a lot of the Germanic tribes, and of course that's when he is thought to have written that. And he, however, for all of his sensible thought, he chooses to break the line of adopted heirs, and he names his son as his co-emperor, that son, of course, being Commodus. So that doesn't work out for him in the end. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what life in Imperial Rome would have looked like. Of course, this is not a painting or anything. It's a photograph from a television show about Rome. But the Roman people lived life according to a set of values known as virtues. Virtus, manliness, essentially. Discipline, strength, loyalty. Kind of the same things we would have associated with perhaps Sparta. Now, this is a very male-dominated society. It's patriarchal. Women's rights are limited. They did have some, but not many. They had the right to own business and property. They could accept a divorce. They could marry. So women typically got married between the ages of 14 and 15. And I don't know if we've discussed this before. Women got married at 14 or 15. Men did not. Men tended to get married around age 30. So yeah, you've got somewhere between 25 and 30-year-old marrying a 14 or 15-year-old. And today we look at that and go, yeah, that's pretty icky. In the ancient world, and even in the medieval world, there's a little bit more reason for this. I'm not trying to defend the concept today, because certainly today it doesn't make sense. But in this world, the main reason was men, being the ones who could solely pretty much do everything, needed to be in a position to be able to take care of a family. And at 14 or 15, they were not. So when they're older and were established and had a home, then they may be able to. Also to be able to pay a dowry, right? Kind of the bride price, what you would pay the family of the girl that would be getting married. Women, on the other hand, tended to get married relatively young because that's their early childbearing years, and so they would be expected to have children at an early age. Much of the reason for this is they're often able to have children more successfully at those young ages in the ancient world, and it's very likely that they will survive to see those children reach adulthood. Men may not, but that's not the man's role. The man's role is outside of the home, the woman's role is in the home. So women tended to be relatively young so that, when they are in their 30s or 40s, their children are starting to get married and leave the home. Or be older sons, right? So that tended to be the reason for this. Women were in Rome allowed to be outside of the home without a man accompanying them. And women, daughters in particular, we talked about, are often named for their fathers, like Octavian and Octavia, right? So, it's not ideal, but for a patriarchal society in the ancient world, women probably have more flexibility in Rome than they may have had before that. So that brings me to what children were doing, or men, and slavery. So education was relatively limited. If you were a son of the upper class, then you could receive an education. Other than that, if you were kind of middle class, lower class, you're not getting an education beyond a few years, and most likely you're going to be some type of worker or soldier. Slavery is a big part of the Roman Empire. We talked before where much of their society is built off of slavery. There are a handful of those slaves who are trained to fight as professional fighters, known as gladiators. And actually, the Colosseum, that's probably most famously known as a location for gladiator fights, was built by one of the Roman emperors right on the spot where Nero's Golden Palace was, that he then tore down and built the Colosseum for the people. Slave revolts are very common. Probably the most famous one in history, I think, is part of the second Servile War. Was led by a man named Spartacus, who was a Thracian slave. I think he ended up with a few thousand followers by the time it was all said and done. He went to battle with the Roman legions and won several times, but eventually was killed. So gladiator fights did not often end in death. I know that's kind of the common custom. It was expensive to kill gladiators, because if your gladiator killed someone, well, you had to pay a fee, right? So you tried to just have them fight for entertainment. The host of the party, which may have even been the emperor on occasion, the whole thumbs up, thumbs down thing is kind of uncommon. That's not really what happened. Instead, they would kind of hold their thumb out, and if they held their hand out flat in the Roman salute, then the person was spared, and if they brought their thumb inward and pointed it at their throat, meant that the gladiator in question was to be executed, the losing gladiator. Then we have the thermae there, which I believe I have a picture of here, which are the Roman bathhouses. So when we think of baths today, even a spa, it's not even quite like that. Right? The thermae are, picture a modern mall, right? Like a mini mall, and you go in and there's shops and stores and theaters and all of that, a courtyard, and then on top of all of that are these bathhouses, like spas. This was a very common place to go for entertainment. It was common to go there to conduct business, to kind of, bathe, of course, to swim, and to relax. So this was somewhere that people went quite a bit, and they were open to the public. They were for everyone, although there were certain portions that would be reserved for the very wealthy, and of course the extravagantly wealthy would have these small versions of these built into their actual homes. So Panem et circensum, or bread and circuses. All right, so up here in the top left, that's a rendition of the Colosseum as it would probably have looked back then. Now, much of it is still intact today. If you wanted to go to Rome, you can go there. In fact, somewhere I have photographs from my trip there, but I'll show you a few things that I found very interesting. So if you were to go there today, you would only see about this much of the floor. So about a third of the floor remains, and I say remains. It's that they have kind of restructured there for you to be able to kind of see what it would look like. It's a wooden deck and then covered in sand. Underneath, where the rest of this all is, there is a very elaborate network of tunnels and chambers and elevators that would allow people to be brought up into the arena. A trap door could open on the one side of the floor and a lion could jump out. They used to do that. In fact, it was more common to have animals fighting people or animals fighting each other than it was to have gladiators fighting one another. That's kind of like the main event. If you're familiar with modern wrestling, it's a lot the same way. Modern wrestling, televised wrestling like WWE, a lot of the way that is structured is much like these Roman Colosseum fights. It's about entertainment. There's the drama, the build-up. There's surprises introduced. There's a bunch of different people that you may not have heard of that all fight first, and they have group battles and tag team and all those type of things. But the main event would be, the big two heavyweights coming to fight one another. Now, amphitheaters were common. The Colosseum is not common. It's massive. It's built right in the center of Rome, and it's actually two of these amphitheaters put together. So the average amphitheater would be like a half moon shaped, and they basically butted two of these up against one another and made the Colosseum. Most gladiators did not fight in the Colosseum. Most fought in the streets or maybe in small arenas or even the bigger amphitheaters, but not in the Colosseum. And by the way, we call it the Colosseum. The Romans would have called it the Flavian Amphitheater. So it was built during the reign of Vespasian, who was part of the Flavian line of emperors. If you look down below, you can see what's known as the Circus Maximus, or the largest circle, which was basically a ring for chariot races. So if you've ever seen the movie Ben-Hur, right? Chariot racing is not as simple as, it's not like NASCAR, right? They're fighting each other as they go. They might chop at the wheels or strike a horse or wreck carts into one another. Still very brutal. But that's what Roman sports are all about. So here's, I guess I did include them. So here's some of the photographs of the Colosseum today. You can see one of the things I thought was fascinating. There's a plaque right here. You can see, and the Colosseum is actually a church today. Now it's not an active church, but it was consecrated as a church by the Roman Pope. And then over on the right, you can see what I was talking about with that deck being built and kind of the chambers underneath. Must have forgot that I included these pictures in here. All right. Talking about the Roman army, like I said, a legion's about 5,500 men, and then there's auxiliaries as well. Legions have separate ranks. There's the legate, the legion legate, the centurion, equestrian, which are horse troops, the legionary, and the aquilifer, which I always like, the person who carries the aquila, the eagle standard of Rome. Primary target, right? It's like the banner man of medieval countries, or the flag bearer of the Civil War, right? Okay, so Greco-Roman culture. Again, Greco-Roman, Greek and Roman culture. We also call it classical culture. It's something that's still very inspirational in medieval art and beyond. Even today, you still see this. Mosaics and the use of olives in art is still quite normal. So some of these artistic styles, the bas relief, like you see up on the top, is where relief carvings. Everything's carved out, but the surface that you want to project. Mosaics, which are small pieces of glass that are arranged, or pottery that are arranged to create an image, and then murals. Romans are famous for their murals. So while the Greeks would have made frescoes, painting on wet plaster, the Romans painted directly on a wall surface, and we still do that today. Murals are still a normal part of artwork today. Roman literature. I think we talked before about the Aeneid. I do have a copy of the Aeneid here, which is the foundation story of Rome. And it's written. My version is written in poetic form, but there are prose copies out there that you can find. And it's Aeneas is the Trojan hero who fought against Achilles and fled the city to go find a new home. And it talks about him basically conquering Latium and establishing what would be the future Romans. Now, Julius Caesar and Octavian are directly tied to Aeneas. So Aeneas being the son of Venus through that chain, of course, then making Julius Caesar and by association Octavian, children of Venus, or great grandchildren of Venus. Now, one other note, I don't know if I mentioned with them, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, the months of July and August. May not have mentioned that, but what's known as the Julian calendar associated with that. But the poet Virgil is the one who writes this story, this epic, and it becomes kind of the backstory for the Romulus and Remus story that you read previously. Ovid, which is a Roman poet, wrote Amores, the love poem. Roman historians here. You have Tacitus and Livy are the big famous two. Livy wrote it's the History of Rome is what it's called. It's a multi-volume version, not really history because he includes everything the gods do, but we can't discount all of it. And then Tacitus is more factual, but he's more focused on like Roman life than grander achievements. So the Annals and the Histories are his two texts. Roman achievements, so Latin, of course, the Latin language itself. It's the vernacular for most of Europe for the next 1,500 years to 2,000 years. It still exists today. You can still study Latin. It's the official language of the Roman Catholic Church today, and it's the basis for what we call the Romance languages, or the Roman-like languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and Italian. So you will actually see Latin quite a bit, and a firm base of Latin understanding could be very useful in attempting to be successful using our language, English. It just does help a lot. And any student of mine doing the word of the day, pretty much everything's based in a Latin root somewhere. So they're useful to be familiar with. I'll include a link with this to a website that helps with learning Latin if you're interested. So Roman achievements, other than, of course, those, you have their architecture and engineering achievements. So the aqueducts, which are the basically bridges for water, or if you think about a duct, right? You have ducting around your home to redirect the water. So the duct, and it's an aqueduct, a duct for water. These actually piped water from the mountains into Rome. Very complex. And it's very accurate. I mean, they are precision made to make the fall of water appropriate to create adequate pressure. It's very, very scientific. I always say that the Romans are not ingenious in their inventions, right? They didn't come up with the arch, but they made it better. They take things from other people's cultures and they perfect them. That's what the Romans do. Even including their combat style. We looked before, they fight in those small groups. They're called maniples or handfuls. That's basically a miniature moving phalanx. They borrowed it from the Greeks. The Pantheon, which is an interesting structure. Many people confuse this with the Parthenon in Greece, but the Pantheon is the temple to all gods. It's built with a dome. I believe it's the first freestanding dome in history. It's basically they take the arch that the Greeks had and they perfect it to go 360 degrees. So Pan means all, Theos means gods, so it's a temple to all gods. And actually, from the inside, if you looked up, there's an open hole to the sky. It's known as the oculi for the gods to enter into the temple. It's not perfect. You actually can see that kind of the front foyer doesn't match up with the back section where it was supposed to. I believe there's a story of the ship that was carrying the columns from Egypt sinking. So to finish the building on time, they had to use columns that were already there that weren't long enough, and boom, roof's too short. But it's still an incredible building. So between the major hills in Rome, you have the Roman Forum. As you can kind of see here, the Forum is the central hub of Roman life. So it's the marketplace, the political center. It's where you would find entertainment. It's where you would witness a trial. It's where you would find the Thermae, the Colosseums. All of this would be a part of this larger complex. It's very similar in that way to the Greek agora, but the Roman Forum is definitely a bit separate from that. It's just the heartbeat of Rome. We talked before about the 12 tables, some of the legal statutes that continue to exist from that all people have a right to equal treatment under the law, that if someone is accused of a crime, they are to be considered innocent until proven guilty, that the burden of proof, right, rests on the accuser. So if you accuse someone of a crime, you have to prove it. Person can't be punished for their thoughts, only for their actions, and that that if a law is unreasonable, it could be removed, which is basically how we amend our own laws. Okay, so with the decline of the Roman Empire, now we're talking about the Western Roman Empire, and we'll get a bit into that in a minute. But there's a lot of different reasons for that decline. There's an excellent book out that is called The Fate of Rome. So the Fate of Rome by Kyle Harper is a book that talks about how large-scale disease and how climate change may have actually held a pretty significant part in the decline of the Roman Empire. So it's definitely worth reading about, especially when you consider disease, ending a civilization. What are we doing? Anyway, economic decline. So trade's disrupted mostly because of wars on the outside and migrating groups that are kind of disrupting trade routes, and that becomes expensive, right? If trade routes start to become endangered, then you have to protect them to make traders and merchants comfortable, which costs more money. These wars that have taken place have led to farms being destroyed, leading to over-farming land that you have, which decreases the fertility of that soil, so you start to run out of food. And then inflation. One of the things that they would do was make coins with less silver. So, you have one coin that's got like the value of 1. Well, you cut it in 2 and make 2 coins that are smaller and expect each of them to still hold the value of 1. People don't see it that way. It's not the same amount of silver. They want their silver. So you end up with that problem as well. Social unrest, you have this divide between the patricians and plebeians. It's always existed, but it's starting to get more fractured, starting to get a little worse. Moral decay. You've got kind of what's known as the third century crisis. There were actually about 26 emperors in Rome over the period of about 50 years. So people see the political offices as untrustworthy, and that means that if you've got good politicians or people who could be good politicians, they're not going to go into those positions because they don't want to be associated with them. Military upheaval, people start to be more loyal to commanders, and you also have the issue of people being bribed instead of actually fought. So they'll keep coming back. It's like the schoolyard bully, right? If he takes your lunch money one day and you give it to him, he's not going to stay away. He'll come back for more. The Roman military starts to pay mercenaries. In fact, some of the people they were actually fighting get paid to come join them. So there's a decline in patriotism and loyalty. So, in an attempt to save all of this, the Roman Emperor Diocletian tries to make the empire more manageable. He cuts it in two and puts, instead of himself as one emperor in charge, basically 4 people in charge. So he has what he calls emperors and Caesars, or like co-emperors. So creates a lot of administrative reforms. Separates the military from like civilians, so personal armies, and then he doubles the size of it, stabilizes currency, fixes some of the tax issues, and moves the seat of power from Rome itself east to a city called Byzantium, which is more wealthy, more cultured, and the east is just overall more successful. So we can see that is actually divided. You can see that Diocletian is at Byzantium or Nicomedia, and Thessalonica becomes the seat of his Caesar. Same within the west, you have Constantinus I and Maximian. That kind of breaking up the empire and making it easier to rule. In the east, they're more Greek speaking. In the west, they continue to speak Latin. Then you have this figure, Constantine. Constantine is an incredible individual. So 305, Diocletian retires. And there's a relatively messy period of transition. Constantine ends up vying for power. There's a kind of a war between these different rulers, and Constantine is on his way to what's going to be one of the major battles, the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and he's brought with him all of these different leaders of religious groups. He's kind of asking them questions and whatnot, and a Christian priest basically tells him to look for a sign from God. So Constantine, in his contemplation for this battle, looks up and sees a cross in the sky with a banner wrapped around it. And on that banner it says, "In hoc signo vinces," or "By this sign, conquer." So he has his troops paint the crosses on their shield. They go into battle the next day and just obliterate the enemy. So he credits the Christian God for his victory, and basically takes Christianity from being something that people were tortured and persecuted for and elevates its status immediately. And then upon conquering the city of Milan, he issues the Edict of Milan the next year in 313, which basically makes it so that a person can practice Christianity without fear of persecution, making Christianity legal. It's in the Roman Empire. Now, I know we're talking about Constantine. We just brushed over Christianity there. It's coming. I'm going to send out a set of notes on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam probably next week. We'll be doing that. So Constantine moves the capital officially from Rome to Byzantium and calls it Nova Roma, or Second Rome, or New Rome. The city is renamed Constantinople for him. It's a very defensible area on the Bosphorus Strait. It's considered a crossroads of trade, center for the culture, and it's very wealthy. Now, at this point, the empire is going to kind of split apart. There's going to be widening divisions between Greek and Italian elements of the Roman Empire. So the church element, you do start to see a church come into construction. Now, this takes a while, but since Christianity has become legitimized, there are kind of creations of these establishments. Now, this is not easy because for 300 years, Christianity has been practiced in secret because people were afraid of persecution. So all of that different time, or all that time separate, has led to a bunch of different ideas about what Christianity is. Different groups of people are involved, different influences, different texts are available, so people believe different things. So the church needs to become more organized, and they start to develop a hierarchy to do so, and they end up centering the church in Rome, even though that wasn't necessarily the first choice. They established what's known as orthodoxy, or kind of the rules of the church. They wanted to make sure that the teachings were consistent and that everybody was, teaching Christianity the right way. So they make an ecumenical meeting, or a meeting to basically discuss the church, known as the Council of Nicaea in 325, and this is presided over by Constantine. They establish church doctrine, they put out what's known as the Nicene Creed, and they condemn any forms of heresy, including Arianism, and try to establish a working set of rules for the church. Now, paganism was still pretty common. People within the Roman Empire would still have worshipped Roman gods, and even though many people would have done what the emperor did, and like Constantine eventually converts to Christianity, many people would have wanted to be like the emperor, but some didn't. So they were what we call pagans. Paganus is the Latin word for villager, but it ends up becoming representative of non-Christians, people who are outside of kind of the tradition, and they're viewed as uncivilized. So they often become a target for conversion. Some emperors, weren't directly involved in this. Others were, like the Emperor Theodosius issues the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, which basically makes Christianity the official religion. So all other religions become illegal. So, in the span of 70 years, Christianity went from being illegal to now being the only religion that can actually be practiced. Now, Rome runs into these barbarian invasions, large-scale invasions that are going to lead to its downfall. Nomadic peoples, Germanic background, we call them the Germanic invasions or the Germanic peoples, and some of them are even actually coming from Asia, mainly being pushed by a group known as the Huns. Pushed westward. So basically the Huns push west, and all of the other Germanic groups whose territory they're pushing into now have to find somewhere else to live, and that just happens to be the Roman Empire. So those Huns, right, they're a nomadic group from Central Asia, united under the leader Attila, who becomes, this massively influential individual who actually even attacks Rome a few times, but they negotiate a truce with the Pope and make some pretty serious money out of it. So Germanic tribes actually had alliances with Rome at different times and were even, somewhat considered Roman themselves. Had similar religious practices, even participated in Roman military service as kind of those auxiliaries or the mercenaries that were hired. But the Huns pushing into their territory changed those relations. The Romans' military was kind of declining, and they had to try and figure out what to do with this mass migration of people into their territory. Basically, the Goths and Vandals and the Frankish people ended up attacking the Roman territories. Rome itself sacked the first time in 410 by the Goths. You can see Alaric the Bold there on the left. The Vandals end up being known for basically destroying Rome. Vandals, hence the word vandalism. And then some of the Celtic tribes even pushed the Romans out of their lands up in Britannia. I do want to mention St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo briefly. He was a bishop of North Africa, and he was a theologian and philosopher. He wrote a book called The City of God, which was basically, that Rome will endure inside of its people, and it is, the true city of God, and that people need to just remain strong in their faith. So the Roman civilization might have collapsed, but then people would turn to the church. The church is the only thing that really survives out of Rome, that even to today still exists. So it becomes a beacon of hope for the people of Rome, as the barbarians are descending on the city and everything they knew is fallen into chaos, and we start to go into the Dark Ages, medieval period. The Romans actually find solace in the church, and so do the people within their empire. That's why the church is able to gain a lot of power and prestige in this period. So the fall of Rome itself, last Roman emperor, 14-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus, and he is deposed and basically surrendered to the Germanic leader Odoacer. That happens in 476, and it's often seen as kind of the final fall of Rome. The West is going to enter into a period known as the Dark Ages, or the medieval period. The East is going to continue to be pretty successful. We're actually going to talk about them briefly now. They won't fall for basically another 1,000 years. And they're known as the Byzantine Empire. We kind of categorize them separately. They wouldn't have called themselves Byzantines, so let's not make that mistake. The people living in the Byzantine Empire saw themselves as Romans. We might call it the Eastern Roman Empire or something like that. They just saw it as Roman. Now we're going to hop around timelines here, because from when this is first created really is Constantine. So we have to sort of rewind to that period, to the 300s, and then pick up until we get to 1453. All right, so very briefly on geography. You can see that the Roman capital was moved to, Constantinople, which is what used to be Byzantium, is now a city called Istanbul in Turkey, or half Turkey, half the Thracian region of Greece. But that's very defensible. It's located right on the Bosphorus Strait near the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. It's ideal for trade, and Byzantium, or Constantinople, is actually known as the crossroads of trade. So in this period, most major trade routes passed through there. This fellow up here, this is the Emperor Justinian. So Justinian the First takes power in the 500s. So this is after the Western Roman Empire has fallen, not long after, about 50 years after. And Justinian was obsessed with the Roman Empire, and so he wants to make Constantinople the new Rome. He wants to rebuild the Roman Empire, reconquer Roman territories. So he sends his general, a guy named Belisarius, to recapture those territories, and he's able to do so for a little while. But the money that goes into holding on to those lands from the barbarian tribes, as well as the money it would have taken to repair everything that was destroyed, just became too much. Justinian's known for a lot of things, including actually the development of a legal code, Justinian's Law Code, which basically he had experts go through all of the existing Roman laws and find the ones that were still meaningful or useful today, and create them into this established codified book of laws. So it becomes actually the basis for all law, even to today, really. It says there 900 years, but that's just while his empire existed. It goes beyond and influences all the laws of most of Europe, and ourselves included. Justinian's also known for constructing the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Now, in its day, this was a Byzantine church, meaning that it would have been an Eastern Roman church, or an Eastern Orthodox church. So we will actually talk about what that means in a little bit. But basically, the church itself looks very similar to what it would have looked like then. The towers on the outside, the prayer towers known as minarets, those would have not been there. And if you look at the picture, the inside on the bottom You can see some of the Arabic script. Allah is named there, as well as Muhammad. None of those would have existed because that doesn't come until much later. But the architecture itself is it really shows, kind of that blended influence of Greco-Roman culture. You can see the Roman dome, the vaulted arches of the Greeks, and eventually the prayer towers and some of the Islamic mosaics added when Constantinople was taken. Empress Theodora is worth mentioning. She comes from uncertain origins. We're not exactly sure what she was beforehand, although it's very likely she was actually a prostitute who was elevated to status when Justinian chose her for a wife. Theodora is very cunning. And she actually is probably responsible for saving Justinian's rule during the Nika Rebellion. I believe she said something to the effect of, Emperor, if you choose to flee, you should do as you choose, but I, for me, will stay. And basically forces Justinian to stay and fight, and he successfully puts down this rebellion at the Hippodrome, using Belisarius and his troops. Theodora even insists on the emperor they chose and others to be publicly executed as a demonstration of power. But just as it began, it's going to end. The Byzantine Empire slowly starts to shrink in power. You have invasions from the Huns and others, corrupt government moving, a series of wars known as the Crusades, and the bubonic plague are all going to impact it. And the empire itself will fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 under the rule of Mehmet. Constantinople will become Istanbul. So we have to talk about the Great Schism, which is the split of the Roman Church. So it goes from being the Church to the Catholic Church, or the Roman Catholic Church, and the Greek Orthodox Church. There's really three major reasons for the division. There's church doctrine, the power of the Pope, and something known as the iconoclasm. So basically, here before you, you have what is considered a Greek icon on the left, which is an image or representation of someone, for religious devotion. And on the right, an idol, which is known as a graven image, that is believed to have supernatural powers. So, idolatry, according to the Bible, is outlawed. Right? You cannot take graven images. You cannot worship an image. In the Eastern Church, icons were initially a part of how everything worked. These icons are sacred. There's a very detailed process to their creation. They take a long time to make, and they're sacred images of holy figures within the religion. Now, these are not the same, but the fact that they get mistaken for the same thing leads to some problems in the Eastern Church. It's known as the iconoclastic controversy, and that occurs when the Emperor Leo III bans the use of icons because he thinks that it goes against the one of the 10 Commandments: "Thou shalt not take unto thee any graven images." So when he sees that kind of blaspheming, he leads to the banning of these icons, and what becomes known as a group known as the iconoclasts, which are people who break icons, follow him. They start to destroy these icons. Now, the Pope, who supported the use of icons, orders Leo to be excommunicated, and it leads to what's known as the iconoclastic controversy. There's a big mess about this, but in 843, a second empress, known as Empress Theodora, lifts the bans on icons, and icons go back into use in the Eastern Church. Now, icons in the Eastern Church are these images. Icons exist in the Western Church too. They're just not images like that. People would use these to aid in prayer and devotion, and I guess Leo saw that as praying to the picture itself. Other reasons for the Great Schism: fights between the Byzantine Emperor and the Pope, as well as the Patriarch and the Pope, on who should control new churches. Basically, because churches brought in revenue, the Byzantine Emperor wanted a cut of that. The Pope didn't want him to have a cut of that, and these disagreements lead to a split in the year 1054, known as the Great Schism. And so the final piece of this is what these two churches end up kind of looking like. The Roman Catholic Church in the West, Latin becomes the official language. Priests are not allowed to get married. Icons are accepted. The Pope has supreme authority, and they follow the teachings of the Council of Nicaea. They also appoint their own Roman emperor. A guy named Charlemagne in the year 800 is named emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, and that kind of offends the Byzantine Emperor. The Eastern Church will have a Greek language. They are allowing their priests to get married. Icons would have that whole mess of the iconoclasm. Patriarch holds power over the church, and the emperor holds power over the people, and they believe in the supremacy of the Father. And then the rest of the Trinity is separate. So you do have some minor differences there. All right, so that ends our episode. Behind me, you can see this wonderful painting of the sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth. So we'll just kind of leave it on this note. I hope you guys enjoyed. I know it was a long one. My voice is certainly raw from it, so I hope you'll break it into several listening sessions. But over the course of the next week or so, this will help you better understand what's going on with the Roman Empire, etc. So until next time, have a good one.